From Vivendi Universal Games, Crash is a loving, carefree bandicoot.
Let's go back to the summer of 2004. I was playing in the backyard with my friends, swimming, roughhousing, and all that good stuff. Suddenly my grandma comes outside and calls me over. In her hand was a Hollywood video booklet. These used to show you all the newest movies and games that had just released or were coming soon. And in the coming soon section, she showed me Crash Twinsanity. It was a bizarre name, there were bizarre screenshots, but having grown up with Crash Bandicoot, I was, of course, very excited. The Bandicoot's last platformer outing, Wrath of Cortex, wasn't exactly well received by the fans, even if I for one loved it, so this sequel needed to be incredible. It needed to impress, and it needed to be entertaining enough to keep everyone invested. Little did we know, this one title would have an immense effect on the entire franchise moving forward. And now it's time to revisit it 20 years later. Crash Twinsanity set many firsts for the series. It was the first Crash game set in a semi-open world, so we could explore more vast environments as opposed to strictly linear pathways, and it was the first to be written as a comedy. Traveller's Tales Oxford wanted the game to feel like the Saturday morning cartoons that originally inspired Crash, and from the animation, to the jokes, to the voice acting, it very much feels that way. I opened this video with the story of how I came across this game for the first time, but how did others in the community find it?
My first interaction with this game was actually at Target. We were walking by the game section and there it was. I knew right then and there that I needed this game. My birthday comes along and what do you know? I get just that game, and I set aside all the other gifts and do nothing but just play this game.
I've had a pretty wild experience remembering the first time I played it as a kid, buying it from the store in 2006 or 2007. I loved it and played it a lot over the years, especially in 2015 before the revival era.
I remember the first time getting Crash Twinsanity back when it first came out. Back when I didn't have internet, I had to just go to EB Games every day to see if there was any new games released. And I remember just seeing the cover, picking it up, taking it home, and thinking, man, this game is so good.
I think the first time I actually got to play this thing in full was through the Crash Action Pack. It was through this and the other games that came with it where my interest with the series got started outside the trilogy.
I was a late adopter of the PS2. When I got mine, there was a Crash Bandicoot triple pack available at Walmart. In that pack were games like Crash Nitro Kart, Crash Tag Team Racing, and Twinsanity. Playing Twinsanity was definitely a big leap for me, as someone who's played the Crash games on PS1 and missed out on Wrath of Cortex.
Man, I spent hours of my life collecting one pose on the beautifully crafted Crash Twinsanity game on my local Xbox.
So as in terms of how I was introduced to it, it was years ago at a hospital. Wrath of Cortex was there and I played it. And then shortly afterwards, I got introduced to Twinsanity because obviously that was the newest game at the time. And that's basically how I got, introduced to Crash Twinsanity. So I already had knowledge of the franchise and everything. But it was cool when I first saw it.
I was introduced to Twinsanity through a website. On the website was a trailer. Upon first watching the trailer, I thought it was a movie. When I found out it was indeed a game, I still got it anyway, and enjoyed playing it.
I first came across Crash Twinsanity in a PlayStation 2 magazine under the title of Crash Unlimited. It showed just one screenshot of the Cortex fight and promised an open world where enemies would band together to take on Crash. I was super excited. It wasn't long before early videos filmed on a potato showed up on places like GameSpot with members of the team teasing the evil twins. Then when the big day was set to arrive, I was riding my bike and was hit by a car. I ended up in hospital with a severely broken arm. So Twinsanity came along and I couldn't play it because my arm and right hand was in a full cast.
Twinsanity is jam-packed with stuff to do. Traverse through the main story, collect gems, use crystals to power up Cortex's giant dimension-hopping machine, and it keeps intact the core elements of the original games. Sliding, spinning, strict platforming, and memorable boss fights. You may have noticed something, however, when checking out the cool content the gems reward you with when collecting them. A lot of the stuff you get to take a peek at never made it into the game. That's where I have to make clear that Crash Twinsanity is an unfinished product.
Twinsanity sparked as a huge inspiration for me as an artist. Collecting gems in the game unlocked a treasure trove of concept art. There's like a lot of art and character designs, story ideas, and gameplay elements that did not make it in the final product.
Sure, the plot has a beginning, middle, and end, but there were so many scrapped ideas, so much that was made for the game but cut at the last minute that trying to recount everything would simply be an impossible task for this video. So let's take a look at some of the most prominent stuff, beginning with the fact that Twinsanity originally wasn't even Twinsanity. It was Crash Bandicoot Evolution.
The game's early concepts with Crash Evolution would have been such an amazing thing to experience as a child with a Crash game because it involved planetary exploration.
I didn't see that stuff until years later, and I mean years later, so by the time it's oh yeah, I mean, it would have been cool to have that, don't get me wrong.
Crash Evolution had interesting ideas for sure in the concepts, and it would have been interesting to have seen how these would have panned out in an official release.
The plot of Crash Evolution was very different as well. While the evil twins were still the villains and Crash and Cortex were still going to team up, the twins in this game were going to abduct the entirety of Insanity Island and add it to their planet, an ever-growing amalgamation made up of other planets. But the reason why this didn't pan out though was because, well, does the plot sound familiar? But looking at these pieces of concept art, it's blatantly clear that Evolution was going to be a sci-fi game. Seeing all these alien creatures and environments is breathtaking to this day. There's still a part of me that wants to see a Crash game like this come to fruition. I wanted to know more about this phase of production, just how ambitious it was going to be, and thankfully a very special guest has shed some more light on Evolution. I reached out to lead designer and writer Paul Gardner, and he provided some great intel on the project. According to him, TT Oxford had already started an open-world demo prior to Evolution in which Crash and Coco would escape from a zoo enclosure. This would explain why Evolution, and later Twinsanity, would go on to be the first open-world game in the series.
As mediocre as it is, it still did one big thing for the franchise, and that's lay the foundation for how an open-world Crash game can be. It set that up really well.
The open world hub-based gameplay is a neat idea to toy around with, although I do feel Tag Team Racing had a much better and more interesting approach on that front.
I was really blown away to see an open world Crash game, a departure from the Crash Bandicoot of the PS1 era with the platforming.
Back in 2004, the hype over Twinsanity was so much fun to be a part of. When the game dropped, I was amazed with it being the first free-roaming entry into the series.
There was also a very conscious decision by both TT and Universal to reevaluate the typical Crash formula that had been used up until Wrath of Cortex. If you've seen my Creative Freedom video, you'll know why that decision was made. Paul stated that, quote, every existing element of Crash's core design principles was reappraised. Wumpa Fruit, for example, became a resource that was used to open gates between gameplay areas and power alien devices. Another mandate by Universal for Evolution was to supplement the classic Crash moveset with some new novel mechanics. They didn't want too many Crash-specific linear moments, so that's where the idea of teaming Crash up with Cortex came about. Another way of Crash getting around these mysterious worlds was with the help of Foofy, an alien creature that wrapped itself around Crash's arm and acted as a grapple, similar to Nina's arms. Because of the similarities to Ratchet and Clank, Evolution was heavily scaled down, getting reworked from a grand sci-fi adventure to a smaller, traditional Crash experience, back on Wumpa Island with a bit of that original sci-fi feel intact with the 10th dimension. The first demo is called the game Crash Bandicoot Unlimited, and people really seem to dig the new look for Crash. After playing with a few more names, including Twinsane, nice, the name Crash Twinsanity stuck, and on September 28, 2004, the game released. On the surface, Twinsanity has a very familiar feel to established fans. But once you really start digging into the game, you'll find it simply bursting at the seams with intricate gameplay ideas and a variety of playstyles. TT Oxford excelled in inventing new, wacky, and exciting things to do and ways to get around. In Twinsanity, you do still primarily play as Crash, but different segments of the game now see you controlling Cortex, the two together in a whirling mass of craziness, and the newly introduced Nina Cortex, the Doctor's niece, who as previously mentioned can extend her robotic arms and strike enemies from afar, as well as grapple onto rings to swing around and scale structures. This is the most variety we'd seen in a Crash game yet, and the moments that transitioned the player between these styles were done spectacularly. I've heard the argument before that the gameplay has too much variety, and that in turn makes it feel unfocused, but I personally feel like this was just an evolution off of that need TT Oxford and Universal had to mix up Crash's gameplay, and it still feels fun to this day.
Eventually, I was able to play it about a month later and was blown away by the smooth frame rate for one, but also how fun and hilarious the game was.
Twinsanity represents all the qualities I want from a fun game. Originality, the freedom to express yourself through play, and iconic moments and mechanics. The juxtaposition of Cortex and Crash made possible concepts like Humilescape, all in the name of just peak comedy. Every level is another burst of ideas, both in story and gameplay. And that's what makes this game so compelling to this day. Cortex is running away from bees, now you're fighting a giant statue, and now you're evading rocket penguins. It never gets old.
The gameplay is good. You have varying gameplay between Crash, Cortex, and Nina. The characters, especially Cortex, are all really solid.
Well, for the gameplay, I think it's cool and amazing, and it kind of reminds me of Crash 4 a little bit.
The gameplay is good in my opinion. Some gems are challenging, and it is funny to get some gems. Example, chickens, right?
The gameplay was really cool. You get to play as a new character, Nina Cortex, as well as Cortex himself and Crash through multiple situations.
The concept of Twinsanity as a game is wonderful. I especially love the first open area for just how many paths there are without branching away from what makes Crash Crash. Getting around never felt dissatisfying in the least, and the secret gems are in tough but fair places.
At the time, Twinsanity was exactly what I had wanted out of a Crash game since the series left the PS1. Honestly, I could be here all day and not run out of things to say about it. How it plays, how much fun it is to break it, what it did for Crash's world and its characters.
You know, Crash and Cortex fighting in the caverns, completely oblivious to the evil twins' plot going on around them. Crash riding on Cortex's back down the mountain before the two of them just turn into a giant snowball. Crash stupidly tying the blimp to a school bus, thinking that would hold it down, only for Nina to have to run away from the flying school bus before it crashes her.
In terms of the gameplay, I think, once again, it shows as another aspect of that turning point of the series where it tries something different.
Now, of course, as I always tend to say, games aren't perfect, and in a lot of fans' eyes, this game is far from it. As much as we love praising the good, we also have to acknowledge the criticisms Twinsanity has gotten over the years. They tend to lean towards the gameplay and cut concepts, and the community has made that very known.
Growing up though, I realized the game is just really mediocre, but it has a lot of charm regardless of my feelings of the game. From the very fun comedic moments and the outright goofy gameplay with the Humilescape sections and other areas, there was a lot to love, but a lot to be disappointed with.
As for the game we did get, pretty disappointing. Like, there was a time where I enjoyed the heck out of this one, maybe even more so than any game that came out before or since, and yeah, that includes the PS1 games. But after the last few revisits I've had with it these past few years, it was pretty underwhelming.
The other thing that drives me kind of nuts about this game is its reputation within the Crash Bandicoot fandom as being this sort of unfinished masterpiece. Certainly unfinished, I'll definitely agree with that, but I don't think it's a masterpiece, and I don't think even with all the missing content that people want to see added back in, that it would be this sort of masterpiece that they seem to believe it could be if there was a remake of it.
There were a lot of issues plaguing the game that kept it from being a much smoother experience coming back to it, which is a real shame because this does have some great ideas, and I'm not just talking about the scrapped concepts.
What always rubbed me the wrong way is how the characters were handled. I know Crash was never the smartest guy, just look at Crash 2, but he was more naive and over the top than outright stupid.
While some people would argue that the gameplay is jank, you know, the jankiness makes the game even more fun in my opinion.
Now Dave brings up a good point. The gameplay is usually hit or miss for people because while most find it fun, some are judging what they actually got to play and could feel that there was obviously supposed to be more. And I find that very interesting and, more importantly, valid. However, it was precisely because of the cut stuff and rushed development that we got... It's utterly insane how many glitches have been found in Crash Twinsanity over the years. One of the most prominent types of Twinsanity videos I remember watching on YouTube back in the day was glitch compilations. I even found this one on my own when I was a kid. You can skip the entirety of the worm chase segment by just grabbing the lip of this totem's collision and gaining some height with a nicely lined up belly flop to hit the cutscene trigger. I was so proud of myself for finding this. I had never seen it documented on YouTube at that time, but who knows, I was likely not the first one to find it. But yeah, ask around and people will tell you.
The game was definitely glitchy at points, but I loved it all the same. In fact, lots of us on the forums would see what glitches we could find, from climbing down Cortex's lab in the 10th dimension, to walking on the roof of the tunnel to Tikimon the totem god.
I also have a lot of fond memories of going to the Vivendi Universal forums, where we would hang out with the devs and they would post unused concepts like the Space Cat trivia and so on. And we talked to each other, just finding new ways to explore the game, and new glitches like playing as Crash and Cortex where you're not intended to.
Fast forward to where we are now, and I'm starting to ask, was Twinsanity always this buggy? I wouldn't call it as glitchy as, say, Wrath of Cortex, but it's definitely up there.
It was obviously unfinished. The bugs are obvious, but there's also the transition from Academy of Evil to Twinsanity Island. It's really abrupt. Like, the second half of the second act is completely missing.
It may be imperfect, but Crash Twinsanity is still one of the most fun games in the series that I enjoy replaying to this day. Or even just messing around with the glitches and breaking stuff.
Honestly, it's kind of a miracle that Twinsanity even came out the way it did. Yeah, everyone knows it's unfinished and it's a bit of a glitchy mess in places, but I think a lot of people obsess over the cut content and what Twinsanity could have been, while kind of ignoring what a solid experience it actually was, and all the memorable sequences it had.
And I can certainly get behind that. Both sides are applicable to me personally. I've heard people call this the Sonic 06 of the Crash franchise, but what sets this glitch-filled experience apart from 06 is that the feel never strayed too far away from what we already knew Crash to be, as several community members mentioned. And the glitches don't usually tend to interrupt or halt progression. A lot of the glitches mentioned are big ones, but ones you had to go out of your way to find, and that's what made them entertaining. But of course, the lack of sound effect cues, the janky animations, and the abundance of random collision made it very clear that noticeable chunks of game are missing. Once again, Paul Gardner shed some light on how the game was structured so that most of the biggest story and progression beats were kept as intact as possible. He says, quote, "Structurally, we planned a core path through the game of the levels that we absolutely needed in order for the story to work. During development, you often find that certain ideas, gameplay setups, etc. don't work the way you planned or just aren't fun to play, and you need to be prepared for that. So it wasn't too difficult to remove certain levels or cutscenes and retain the foundation of the story. We also did a pickup voiceover recording session towards the end of the project, which helped us bridge some gaps." This is backed up by Cortex saying this late into the game.
"Come now, as we explore a new dimension!" It should have been 2 new dimensions, but we ran out of time.
Quote again from Paul, "But even then, certain story threads remain unresolved, like the Psychotron or the twins' vice versa reverser device, for example, which is mentioned once and never referred to again. The twins' evil plan is never really clear, but hopefully it still kinda works. The short answer as to why Crash Twinsanity is so buggy and unfinished, yet still in a playable and completable state, is because TT Oxford did have a main structure set, but so much had to be cut for various reasons. But with how much gameplay variety that made it in, and how fun those moments are to play, I think that's what ultimately helped save Twinsanity from undergoing a similar fate to games like Sonic 06. Another striking feature about Twinsanity is its art direction. This would be the first time all the characters got a major design update after the previous installments Wrath of Cortex and Nitro Kart started slowly tweaking them. For a lot of fans, these looks are iconic.
Back then, I thought it was fine. Loved the stylized art direction.
I liked some of the design work that they did for the models. I think Crash and Cortex look great here. It's some of the best visual appearances for them in the entire history of the series.
And for those who wanted to see more of the classic villains, some of their looks didn't gel too well.
But then I also look at characters like Tiny, Koala Kong, Pinstripe, who just look a bit in this game, for a lack of a better word. Even my favorite character, Entropy, just looks kind of wrong in this game. Like, I don't know what it is, but I look at the design for him and go, nah, this doesn't do it for me.
But it was the blending of the 3D look and feel of the in-game characters and world with the 2D cartoonish artwork of the HUD, level of loading screens, and even the front of the box that made Twinsanity really stand out. I was always so enamored with that front cover. It's simple, but unique, and once again perfectly captures that Saturday morning cartoon vibe. A great chunk of, if not most of, the art was done by Keith Webb, and he did an amazing job at making the characters and world look and feel as colorful and wacky as ever with his sharp action-packed art style. So why was this direction chosen? What were some of Keith's favorite pieces to work on for the game? And a certain character got a lot of attention in the art, but had their role drastically cut down in the final game. What happened to them? I had the pleasure of asking Keith himself these exact questions, and he provided a lot of much needed and much appreciated backstory and trivia. According to Keith, quote, "I can't actually remember at what point it was decided to use the 2D art for the various loading screens and HUD elements, etc. I think it may have always been the case, as I remember doing some 2D artwork for one of the demo versions, a splash screen with the PS2 controller to show the basic controls, and maybe the rest of the loading screens, etc. followed on from there. Fun fact, Keith also told me that in the pause menu, the title logos for each level were inspired by the racetrack logos from Mario Kart Double Dash, and the game over graphics were inspired by the continue screens from Sonic 2 and Street Fighter 3. Some of Keith's favorite enemies to work on were Engine's pirates like the Rhino and Platypus, the Lobotomouse and Froggenstein creatures from the Academy of Evil, he even personally named them, and he cites Rusty Walrus as his favorite character because he's so dopey looking. But now let's get to that character who had their role cut down. That would of course be Coco. She was going to be yet another playable character alongside her brother, Cortex and Nina, and is featured in both concept art and promo images, but ultimately she's reduced to the running gag of getting petrified directly or indirectly by Cortex. The most prominent cut level from Twinsanity that fans are very aware of is called Gonna Bit Coco, and would have seen Cortex going through Coco's mind, running around a cutesy cartoony town fighting adorable fuzzy animals. But not only that, Coco was also supposed to hack into Cortex's castle from the first game in a level called Security Insanity, and she's shown in this piece of art riding on an ostrich, which Keith hypothesizes may have morphed into Farmer Ernest, and she was even going to have her own 10th dimension counterpart with Evil Coco, but even she got scrapped. What happened here? Why was Coco's role cut down so drastically? The short answer is likely time constraints, and it was probably content that could be sacrificed without hurting the overall story like Paul mentioned. But Keith actually remembers some stuff here. Quote, "I recall seeing Coco in some different outfits that may have been related to her Matrix-style CPU stages that came from Duke Maiden, who was a concept artist on the game long before I started. I think later the idea of the Security Insanity stage being placed near the giant stairs on the proposed third island, just before the final Cortex castle area in the original Crash 1 map islands, was to tie it into the existing storyline. The idea would have been that they all needed to get access to Cortex's airship to travel to the Academy of Evil, and Coco needed to hack into the security system to help Cortex break back into his castle and steal back his airship, as the twins had locked it away. I do have a vague memory of someone testing out Coco's proposed moveset in some sandbox areas that could have been worked up to look like internal CPU Matrix-esque stages, but I might be misremembering. I'm pretty sure the whole Coco/Matrix/hacking into CPUs came about because she always carried her laptop with her, hence the hacking connection. I've always said Coco should have had some technical/hacking aspects integrated into her gameplay, and the fact that we were going to get it in Twinsanity would have been really cool. As far as Gonna Bit Coco goes, it was known internally as Cute World, and was already in development before Keith joined the team. It was even featured in trailers and promo screenshots. The point of this level was for Cortex to gain important intel from Coco's mind that only she knew after she'd been paralyzed by the Psychotron. Looks like that running gag was meant to have more reasoning behind it. According to Paul in the comments of this video, which is a storyboard of the scene, even Nina was later meant to visit Coco's mind to repair the damage Cortex had done. In an interview with Jump Button, Paul later revealed that the level was axed because it was too glitchy, and with all this stuff cut and scrapped, Coco's role was diminished from prominent playable character to side character barely included in the main story. Despite the content that was cut, be it early in development or at the very last second, Twinsanity still manages to set itself apart, not just in the art and the gameplay, but the music as well. We cannot talk about Crash Twinsanity without mentioning the music. The game's soundtrack was done by the extremely talented a cappella group Spiralmouth, a band that makes music entirely with their voices. This type of music, in its modern form, has been around for quite a long time, but groups such as Spiralmouth have really pushed the boundaries of what the human voice can do with the help of pedals and other effects to extend their sound past what just the raw voice can provide, and this in turn gives them a very current alternative feel. Once again, I had the absolute pleasure of talking to Gabriel Mann, one of Spiralmouth's prominent members, and asked him a few questions about how they were pulled into the project and so forth. When asked about how they were contacted for Twinsanity, Gabriel answered, quote, "We performed regularly around Southern California, and at some point were playing at a club in Los Angeles where some people from Vivendi Universal Games happened to be in attendance. They were towards the beginning of production on Twinsanity, and thought we had just the right mix of cool mixed with unusual sounds that would work for the score. When they approached us with the idea, it was a no-brainer for us. We've been looking for ways to expand our footprint and, frankly, earn some money as composers and not just as a touring band. We had all heard of Crash Bandicoot, but weren't deeply involved, as we soon became. Despite a minority of fans claiming the music didn't really feel like Crash, which is understandable, the majority loves this game's soundtrack.
The music complements the simplicity of the game. It's a cappella, pretty much the easiest way to write music.
The full-on a cappella soundtrack being so unique to the game has also cemented its beloved legacy.
I think the music in that game is really good. It's probably my favorite soundtrack in the entire Crash Bandicoot franchise.
I love the music. I feel like acapella, Spiral Mouth is just a perfect crew for Crash Bandicoot. It's a shame we don't have that type of music anymore.
The music is fantastic. I really love the music. The Iceberg Lab soundtrack is so iconic and nostalgic for me.
Right off the bat, the music, complete acapella, definitely loved it.
The soundtrack is also what makes this game very distinct from the rest of the series, which I think I heard could be divisive, but honestly, I like it. I think it's memorable.
The a cappella soundtrack really stuck with me too.
One of my favorite things about Crash Twinsanity was the music. Spiral Mouth did an amazing job making a cartoony and Crash-like soundtrack. It does sound like something out of a Saturday morning cartoon, which is awesome.
As for me, I adored it. It got me into wanting to learn how to beatbox. I found groups like Noda, Cornell Cordials, Van Canto, Vocal Point, and so many more. Not to mention a cappella YouTubers like Mike Tompkins and Triforce Films. I may have eventually gotten into this kind of music later in my life if I hadn't heard it first in Twinsanity, but I have Spiral Mouth specifically to thank for finding a cappella when I did. This even led me to uploading the entirety of their 1999 self-titled album to YouTube on my old Pinbusters channel back in the day. I was the first person to do so, and I even started listening to Gabriel's solo stuff. Hell, I even tried playing the PS3 first-person shooter Time Shift specifically because I'd found out Gabriel and fellow Spiral Mouth member Rebecca Newell did the soundtrack. That's how crazy strong of an impact Twinsanity's music and the group behind it had on me. And in terms of cultural impact, we can't forget this iconic meme. I was very curious to learn how Spiral Mouth approached doing a track for the game. When asked about this, Gabriel told me, quote, "We were given a lot of creative freedom for Twinsanity. The team outlined the levels and bosses we needed to write for, gave us all the parameters in terms of timing and such, and more importantly told us the story of each character and what each level and personality was all about. The team at VU shared images and animation as it was being developed, and we wrote themes alongside them, so it all took shape together very organically. Ultimately, the levels are relatively straightforward in terms of character and story, but we did try to make each piece of music reflect the feeling of those characters and what was supposed to be happening in terms of the energy of each level." I'd say this is very true. Go back and really listen to some of these tracks. The lighthearted, humble beginnings of the journey on Insanity Island, the fizzing and whirring of machinery in Boiler Room Doom, the gloomy, melancholic feel of entering the 10th dimension, and even the silly covers of classical pieces like Blue Danube or Flight of the Bumblebee. All these tracks feel like they fit, and add to the overall atmosphere of the experience. Gabriel personally enjoyed working on the music for Madame Amberly and Rockslide Rumble. He also cites this flying saucer chase, which I remember concept art for, but I don't think we ever heard the music to. It could have been one of the unused tracks. And stated that the most challenging track to perform was the Evil Twins boss theme, because of how fast-paced it was. And yeah, it alongside An Agony are the ones with the least human-sounding qualities. I was also very curious about how the musicians took up and switched roles per track. If you didn't know, no one member would stick to one instrument, so that would affect who was most prominently heard and how everyone would sound in each track. I personally love their electric guitar and beatboxing percussion, so I asked about those, and Gabriel said guitar was usually himself, Antonio Saul, or Chris Miller, and the percussion was also passed between either Chris or himself, which I never knew and thought that was really cool. He also says, quote, "There are a few tracks that are laid out like a traditional rock band with just drums, bass, and guitars as the backbone with some sort of melodic line on top. In those instances, the guitars were often a combination of many of us, including Becky and Michael Blanchard, who normally served as our bass, but had some lead melodic roles as well. This music was made during the birth of digital recording, so in addition to actual hardware guitar pedals, we were able to use plugins like Ampfarm and other such guitar emulators in the box. But it turns out that most of the work of making a cappella sound less like voices and more like a band is in the actual performance of the parts. The way a bass sings a bass line, the way an alto sings a rhythmic guitar part, in terms of the actual syllables and position of the mouth making the sounds into the microphone. These are far more impactful than dropping on a distortion plugin. The singing, the arrangement, the performance, these are the cake, while the plugins and post-production effects are the frosting. I like this answer because I can certainly feel that. Now, I'm not a musician, I only played frickin' tuba in 6th and 7th grade, but I've been told I do have an ear for music, and when it comes to performing with the mouth, it may sound simple as OBD put it, but what Gabriel is saying about how you actually have to perform these sounds is absolutely true. Spiral Mouth makes it sound cool and look easy, but everyone's role per track is crucial. The effects can only take the music so far, but it's the musicians themselves that have to play correctly. Thankfully, everything's got an incredibly tight flow, the group is very talented and professional at what they do, and that resulted in one kick-ass OST for the Crash series. Phew, that was a lot to cover. Well, since I brought them up a bit here and there throughout the last couple segments of the retrospective, I guess now would be a good time to move on to the characters.
Oh, I see you're going to talk about the characters of Crash Bandicoot. Well, you can't do that without talking about the greatest character ever developed, and that would be me! Carry on.
Thanks, Cortex. Hey everybody, it's Lex Lang, voice of Dr. Neo Cortex, and I just wanted to wish you all a fantastic Crash Community Day. And, well, there's nothing better to celebrate than the Crash Bandicoot game franchise. And I've had such a terrific time being a part of it. This marks 20 years for me. I started at Crash Twinsanity, and it's been a great time ever since. So I just wanted to thank you all for continuing to play the game, enjoy the characters, and just having a great old time when you're playing. So have a fantastic day, and my best to you always. Take care.
Thanks so much for the message, Lex. That's right, we've got to go a little more in depth on the characters. I've already talked a bit about the design changes in the art style segment, but now it's time to fully dive in. One of the most striking and specific features I've seen people like HP Zona report on Crashmania is that all characters have 5 fingers in this game, which is funny because that odd little detail tends to change depending on the game and developer. Crash has got a radical new look with knee pads and Converse sneakers, and Cortex has gone all in on his yellow skin and red gloves and boots. Plus the N on his forehead is now plated on instead of tattooed on. Nina seems to be the fan favorite of this game, going full on Hot Topic goth with her schoolgirl outfit, thick mascara, and heavy metal theme song. And as previously stated, we even get to see a ton of classic villains Twinsanity-ified, though depending on who you ask, some designs tend to be hit or miss.
I really love the characters. I love the evil twins. I wish that they had done more with the evil twins, and it just really felt like an expansion for the Crash Bandicoot world that was really needed at the time.
I think they're a cool amount of characters, along with their models.
And we got to see all the cameos from the beloved characters, including Spyro, which was a really nice treat.
As some fans may remember, I was a Crunch Bandicoot fanatic, so imagine my excitement when I found out that he was added into the game because of my crazy obsession at the time. I'll forever be thankful to the devs for doing that for me, but more so, grateful for this game to have come into existence.
It's the roles, though, that are particularly worth mentioning. Like Coco, the other villains were going to be more involved, but were heavily watered down. But the ones TT did choose to focus on are very interesting, as the in-game time skip led them to doing other things with their lives, and they're not too keen on following Cortex this time around. But, as the voice of the dog himself said, we can't talk about this game without mentioning the gigantic impact it had on Cortex. The idea of Crash teaming up with his arch-rival not only led to unique gameplay ideas, but also an introspective look into the eyes and thoughts of the Bandicoot's main villain. Since Crash is absolutely silent in this game, yeah, he doesn't even exclaim "whoa" when he dies, Cortex has to do all the talking, and having a pathetic yet highly intelligent, impatient villain practically handcuffed to a brainless yet fearless hero leads to all sorts of insanely hilarious shenanigans.
Oh, and of course, who could forget that this was the game that introduced Lex Lang taking on the role of Dr. Neo Cortex, a role that he still holds to this day, 20 years later, because everyone knows that everything this man says is pure gold.
This game was silly and it wasn't afraid to show that, especially through Cortex.
Fantastic humour, and one of my favourite takes on Cortex to this day. He really shines in this one.
And then when I found out you could play as Cortex, well, believe me, it was my favourite Crash game for a long time after that.
All the Crash games kind of were wacky, but I feel like Twinsanity was the start of like finding a direction for Cortex.
The characters were really funny. I like the dynamic between Crash and Cortex. I mean, that was Cortex's shining game. That's basically the Neo Cortex game.
I think that Crash Twinsanity serves as a turning point for the series in terms of the narrative, because we get to understand Cortex as a character.
Cortex was always a highlight, and I love the story beats they took.
You can play as Cortex, and I like it.
My mum in particular has a favourite line from Cortex. Come on, follow me, Crash. Stay close and do what I do.
It's been made very clear that as far as characters go, Cortex is the glue that holds this game together. And Paul had a few interesting thoughts to share on Lex's casting and the direction TT wanted to take the character. He says that he actually initially wrote Cortex's lines with Clancy Brown's interpretation in mind, but seeing as Clancy dropped out of the series after NitroCard and wasn't available to reprise the role for Twinsanity, they lined up 17 actors to read lines from NitroCard during the audition process, with some of Clancy's performance provided as reference. Lex stuck out to them immediately, being described by Paul as characterful and nuanced, and finding him opened up the potential for what could be done with the character. It's also important to note that here Paul says that even though they couldn't get Clancy, he feels he would have totally nailed the new tone, meaning that even though originally the lines were being written with Clancy in mind, it was always the plan to show off this new wacky, pathetic side of Cortex and lean even further away from the darker, more sinister take we know Clancy's Cortex can be. This leads directly into that exact change. Why did it happen? Why is Cortex less foreboding and more campy? Paul explains that, quote, as we made the transition from Crash Evolution to what became Twinsanity, we were assigned a new senior producer by Vivendi Universal called David Robinson. The direction until then from the publisher had been to make the game darker and more edgy, which for me never quite fit with Crash as a character. David's direction to us was to really go for it and make the game as funny as possible. I thought of it not so much as a change in Cortex's personality, but more that we're seeing a facet of him that's previously been hidden. A part that is only revealed by him being totally thrown out of his comfort zone and losing his position to power. And you know what? That makes a ton of sense. This is the first time either of these guys have had to essentially live with each other throughout this whole journey. It's like the iconic tagline says, they may be working together, but they don't have to like it. And you really feel that in Lex's performance. The years of isolation with only penguins for company, as Paul puts it, and having to deal with a multi-dimensional threat that is so much bigger than him or Uka Uka pushes the character into a box. So this whole game is a constant punchline to the question, how would he react in this situation? Another fun fact, Paul also told me Cortex's temp dialogue, which can be partly heard in some demos, was done by lead artist Dan Tonkin.
How I envy the simple life of the tribesfolk.
He was apparently so good the team actually tried to kind of fight for him to be the official voice, but it wouldn't be possible since Twinsanity was a SAG project. At the end of the day though, this game provided an incredibly compelling and hilarious take on most of the characters, all in the name of keeping that new wacky, satirical nature consistent. To this day, Crash Twinsanity is still an interesting game. It came at just the right time to shake things up when the franchise desperately needed it, and provided us fans with an amazing, comical, and unforgettable experience. From the gameplay, to the art style, to the music, and the characters, this game lives rent-free in many people's hearts, and inspired them in ways they probably never realized they could be. Not to mention the hype that was drummed up prior to and directly after the game's release. Who remembers going on the Crash Bandicoot website when it was decked out with Twinsanity content? Who remembers the commercials featuring Steve-O and Chris Pontius from Jackass? Who remembers when those unused storyboards went up on the internet? This one here was the first YouTube video I ever watched, and I have this game to thank for that. Paul goes on to say, quote, it's lovely to think what we made means something to somebody somewhere. I'm still constantly amazed by the life Twinsanity has had, its longevity, and how new generations of players somehow find it. It's strange to realize that some players hadn't yet been born when the game was released. He also says he's very proud of the game, stating, quote again, it was my first published game and I learned so much from working on it and from the people I worked with. It has its flaws, but I think you can tell how much effort and care the team put into making it. It feels kind of handmade. I like that when I look at it, I can see something of every member of Traveler's Tales Oxford, some individual contribution that each of us made to the whole. And it's fun. And funny. He also says there is still a lot of potential in the Crash Cortex team-up dynamic, but he wouldn't want another dev team to have to go through that kind of process like they did, coming up with all kinds of gameplay mechanics. It's been lovely for him to see the characters introduced in Twinsanity become an integral part of Crash's role in the years since, and he'd love to see more appearances from Nina in the future.
It's surreal how much this game has impacted my life. I want to say I've done everything I could do in this game, but it's probably not true. And that's a great reality to be in.
Twinsanity felt like it set a new direction for the Crash brand.
It's a game that means a lot to me, where I ended up meeting many of my longtime friends, one very close friend in particular, who I travelled halfway around the world to meet up with. He is now my husband, and the rest is history.
My life would have been drastically different if I hadn't played it when I did. It was thanks to this game that I met some of my best friends, one of whom is now my wife. And of course, we do play it together. It's a game that's much more than meets the eye.
I frequented the official VU forums, and one of my favourite things that happened back then was the influx of new members that came from the Twinsanity hype and the fan reactions. I made lifelong friends during that era.
Crash Twinsanity is considered one of my favorite video games, and it became a
cult classic within the Crash fandom despite being rushed and not well received.
As far as the PS2 Aero Crash games go, I'll have to say that Crash Twinsanity is the best one. And I think that's because it struck the best balance between innovating the series and also just being faithful to what Crash is.
Happy 20 years. 20 stinking years!
Crash Twinsanity is such a fun experience, and it's crazy to think that it's influenced so many people, as well as the franchise, well into the post-hiatus titles. Happy 20 years to one of the most influential Crash games in the series.
The current still. We fight the current still. We fight the current still. We fight the current still. Bob. 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 Bob.